Hello, this is our first recording of week 2. Today we'll be talking about social factors in crime. This is a really interesting topic, and if you aren't mathematically inclined, please don't let that scare you away from that word factors there. So what we'll be talking about today is trends in crime since 1995, and then some of the reasons for those trends. We often talk about, crime is just out of control these days. What are we going to do about crime? Crime's always going up. But the reality of the matter is that since 1995, crime rates have been dropping pretty dramatically. If you look at some of the charts in your book for this week's readings, you'll see that our society at this moment, at least in terms of crimes committed, is about as safe as it was in the 1960s, despite the fact that we have this perception that the world is a much more dangerous place. It's important to note that even though certain political groups, traditionally more Republican groups, but also Democrat groups, Republicans are often given this label as being more law and order, and Democrats are typically given a more lenient haze on the issue. But the fact of the matter is that Democrats in the 1990s were very much playing the law and order bit. A big part of Bill Clinton getting elected in the mid-90s was his, quote, harsh stance on criminality. And again, it's not just Democrats, though. George H.W. Bush talked a lot about law and order. Ronald Reagan talked about law and order. It was very much a cultural meme at that moment. And sorry, I didn't capitalize Democrat and Republican there. That was an error. So it's more complex than politics. It's more complex than the recessions we're in. It's not that our economy, it's not because our economy isn't as good as it was in 1995 that crime rates have gone down. As a matter of fact, some people often think crime rates are going to go up during poor economies. We'll talk about that too. Or this is what we call, as social scientists, multifactorial. So there are many factors involved with it. It's more than just politics. It's more than just the number of prisons we have. There are many layers to this issue. Your authors, Uggan and McElrath, identify 6 reasons for this particular drop in crime. So the 6 sources of the crime drop. The first is punishment. Yes, we have had some impact on this crime drop because we have built so many prisons that we're talking about in this class, but it's likely that only about 1/9 of the phenomena of this crime drop can be tied to the fact that we have more people in prisons. And the authors point out, and I very much tend to agree with them, that the other factors involved here have more to do with the crime drop than the fact that we have so many more people in prison than we did in 1995. That's a reality. We do have more people in prison, but that might not have much to do with the actual drop in crime. Our second factor is policing. Police techniques have dramatically improved since the early and late 90s. This is largely due to technological advantages we've developed. Surveillance technology has come an amazing way. Cameras are in everything. Audio recorders are in everything. I can't see the microphone. I can barely see the camera on my computer. DNA technology. Remember, the very first big trial to use DNA technology was the O.J. Simpson trial, and in that trial, that technology wasn't even that well respected. So DNA technology that's seen basically as the gold, almost the gold standard in modern courtrooms. That's new stuff. It's also important to note that there are other factors that were introduced in the 80s and 90s that don't actually work. Follow-up visits with domestic violence victims. This was a big thing that they tried in the 90s and 2000s, that when there was a call of domestic violence, police would go back later just to make sure everything was, quote, okay. Or it sounds like a good idea, but statistically that has been shown to not be very effective. Another thing that is grossly ineffective is the DARE programs that you may have been involved with in elementary school or high school. DARE has pretty unequivocally been shown to be, for lack of a, no, it's a waste of money. It's a waste of police resources. It's a waste of public resources. The reason it continues is because it's popular. Cops like to interact with kids, and good for them for liking to interact with kids. Kids like to see cops. It's great for PR for the police departments, but statistically, those kids involved in DARE programs are not less likely to use drugs or alcohol or whatever. If you'd like to learn more about that problem, you can research the work of Dr. Richard Ludman. He was one of my mentors in graduate school. His work on the subject is very good. You can probably also Google search DARE doesn't work. I would suggest using DARE doesn't work, LUNDMAN, because otherwise we just see a bunch of kids smoking pot and wearing DARE t-shirts probably. Number 3, opportunities for crime. Crime is harder than it used to be. Targets have, quote, been hardened. So your iPod, you probably have to unlock it to use it. Your phones, you have to unlock to use. Your computers, everything, you have to unlock almost any piece of technology to use it. Cars are dramatically harder to steal than they used to be. Security systems are quite common. You can get a relatively difficult to disarm security system for about $150 at a hardware store. And also, remember, it's so part of our lives, it's hard to forget. It's easy to forget, but 911, that, that emergency number was relatively new in the early 90s, and that may have that in all likelihood did contribute dramatically to the ability of criminals to not get away with it. Number 4, though, economics. Economics does have an impact on crime. And we'll talk about this in our lectures in our next lecture, I believe. We'll be talking about strain theory. So when things get rough, sometimes people do turn to crime. But to counter that, other people, those not committing crime, will stay home more. So they won't necessarily go to the mall because they don't have any money. They won't go out to eat. They won't do the things that they would do if they had money. And crime occurs when people interact with each other, typically, most crimes. So you can't be robbed if you stay in your house. You can't, all kinds of crimes can't happen when people aren't spending money. And this is very much backed up by the statistic that crime rates dropped pretty steeply during the 2007 to 2009 economic downturn. And most commenters, most sociologists and economists point to the fact that it's because people didn't have money, so they couldn't be in public, so they couldn't be mugged, etc. Number 5 of the 6, demography. The age of the population and influxes in immigration have both contributed to this drop in crime. Remember, and the baby boomer generation, they were and will, until they are gone, continue to be greatly influential on our society, largely because of their sheer numbers. There are a lot of them, of those people born between the end of World War II and 1960. Those people, they shaped our society. When they were young and rebellious, they led to a lot of powerful social movements. Once they settled down, they led to the building of massive suburbs outside of our cities. And when they were in their prime, what are considered the prime crime years, which are about from the age of about late teens to 30s, that's when we had, in all likelihood, a spike in crime that was from the 70s to the early 90s. And then when those people calmed down, formed families, or got arrested, those crime rates went down. Similarly, immigration had an impact on this. We have had a boost in immigration in the United States since the mid-90s, and that actually prevents crime. New immigrants, contrary to what some of the rhetoric says, new immigrants actually prevent crime for a variety of reasons. First of all, a potential criminal who isn't really familiar with the society that he's in can't really figure out what kind of grift would work, right? And immigrants have a tendency to move into communities of fellow immigrants and to be tight-knit within those communities. When you are tight-knit within a community, you will not steal from your fellow community members because you know them very well, first. Second, when you are tight-knit in a community, you're less likely to interact with people on the outside. So if you don't know anybody outside of your community, you don't interact with those people, but you're unwilling to hurt somebody in your community, you won't commit crime. 6, finally, we have to look at longer-term social dynamics. The stats we have in terms of history are relatively new. We've only really been keeping track of these things since about the 1940s. And there's a distinct possibility that crime was dramatically higher in the 1800s and before, and that what we saw in the jumping crime from the 50s to the mid-90s, that may have been a historic blip. It doesn't seem like that to us now because we are so close to it. But in 200 years, it might be absolutely obvious to social scientists that that was just kind of a thing that happened by either an influx in population or some sort of economic factor related to the post-war period, something like that. So in this week's discussion, I want you to talk about one of those 6 factors, and which do you find most interesting? Among the things I want you to talk about in that, does anything within that factor's influence on crime, does that surprise you? Would you not have thought of that before, or does it make a whole lot of sense to you? Does this factor have any particular impact to your community? Or lack of impact to your community. So if there are a lot of immigrants in your community, you could talk about that. If there are not many immigrants in your community, you could talk about that too. You will be able to find that discussion on the discussion board, just like you did last week with the introduction. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I will be monitoring the discussion boards, so feel free to either ask me on there or send me an email. Okay. Thank you.